The Saturday, my wife gave me an ultimatum in front of her whole family at her brother's cookout in Farragut. I already knew what was happening, not every detail, but enough. Enough to not raise my voice, enough to not flip the folding table, enough to not do the thing she'd been waiting for me to do for months. Because if I lost my temper, the rest of the story wrote itself, and I became the problem. That's how those situations work when they're engineered right. They hand you the perfect excuse to destroy yourself, and they wait. I didn't take it. I stood up, shook hands with her brother, walked to my truck. She said it in front of her mother, her brother, her sister-in-law, and 3 nephews who've been running through a narration all afternoon. You've got 2 choices, Ray. You apologize or you go home. I went home. 3 days later, when my absence stopped looking like a sulk and started looking like something else, her sister called to ask if I was okay. Diane came back to the house with her key, walked straight to the kitchen, and found the envelope I'd left on the counter, beside the coffee maker. I still think about the look on her face when she opened it, but to understand what was in that envelope, you need to understand who I am. Because this story doesn't start at her brother's cookout in Farragut. It starts about 15 years earlier in a rented van on I-40 heading east toward a job site in Knoxville that was either going to make or break the most important decision I'd ever made. My name is Ray Calloway. I'm 50 years old. I was born in Kingsport, Tennessee, grew up in a 3-bedroom house on the same street my father grew up on, and moved to Knoxville when I was 26 because that's where the work was. I'm a licensed master electrician. I've been one since I was 31, which means I passed the state board examination on my first attempt after 5 years of journeyman work and 2 years of independent study. I did not go to college. I went to work. I want to be clear about what I mean by that. I'm not saying it as a complaint or as a badge of pride. I'm saying it as a plain fact about how I understood the world at 18, which was that the thing I was already good at was worth more than the debt I'd have to carry to learn something I wasn't sure about. My father never pushed me toward a university. He pushed me toward competence. There's a difference. My father was a foreman at a paper mill in Kingsport for 31 years. He retired on a pension and a handshake and died 3 years later from something nobody saw coming. He taught me 2 things that stuck. Do what you said you were going to do and read everything before you sign it. I was good at the first one. I let the second one slide when it mattered most. I started Callaway Electrical Services in 2009 during a stretch when most people weren't starting anything. I'd saved for 6 years, had 4 commercial clients who'd said they'd follow me if I went independent, and a used white van with 240,000 miles that I drove into the ground over the next 3 years before I could afford to replace it. The first year was thin enough that I considered calling one of my old bosses and asking if there was a spot back. I didn't. The second year was better. The third year was the year I could stop watching my bank account every morning before I got out of bed. Callaway Electrical today handles commercial installation and maintenance contracts across Knox County and parts of Blount and Anderson counties. I have 6 full-time employees, 2 subcontractors I use regularly, and a list of clients that includes Knox County government buildings, 2 hospitals, and a distribution center off I-75 that I've held the maintenance contract on for 8 years running. It is not a large company. It is a reliable one. There is a difference. My mornings start the same way they've started for 12 years. I'm up at 5, coffee from a drip maker on the counter. Black, no sugar. I sit at the kitchen table for 20 minutes before anything else happens. No phone, no news, just the sound of the neighborhood coming awake outside the window and whatever I'm thinking about for the day. My neighbor Aaron Pell, who lives 4 houses down and has been retired for going on 8 years, once told me that the most underrated skill in the world is sitting still for 20 minutes in the morning before anyone asks you for anything. He's right about that. I met Diane Voss at a Chamber of Commerce mixer in downtown Knoxville in the fall of 2013. She was the HR director for a regional subsidiary of a larger corporation that had recently moved its Tennessee operations to Knoxville, and she had that particular quality that I've only ever seen in people who are genuinely good at managing other people. She listened in a way that made you feel like what you were saying mattered before she decided whether it did. I liked that. I spent a long time confusing that quality for something it was not. We got married in 2015 at a small ceremony at a rented space on Market Square. 30 people, dinner afterward, nothing elaborate. Diane wasn't a big occasion person, and neither was I. The early years had a rhythm that worked. She traveled for work every few weeks and I ran the business. When she was home, we cooked together on Sunday evenings. She made the sides, I handled whatever was on the grill, and we'd eat at the patio table out back and let the evening go at whatever pace it wanted to. It was not a dramatic life. It was a solid one. I thought we both wanted that. The first sign I missed came in 2018. Diane suggested I convert Callaway Electrical from a sole proprietorship to a multi-member LLC. Her reasoning was sound on the surface. Liability protection, cleaner separation of business and personal assets, better positioning if I ever wanted to bring in a partner or seek a line of credit. She said she could handle the filing herself since she dealt with business structures regularly through her HR work, and it would save me the cost of an attorney for something this straightforward. I signed the operating agreement she prepared without reading every clause the way I should have. That was the mistake she calculated I'd make, and she was right. The second sign came a year later, when 2 of my county maintenance contracts renewed with a different entity name in the header. Diane explained it was an administrative change tied to the LLC structure, that the billing had been routed through the new entity for tax efficiency, that the operational relationship was unchanged. I was in the middle of a large installation job in Oak Ridge, and I let it go. The third sign I should not have let go. In February of 2022, Jim Ostrander de Satiquaina Cur, Fasidera Gin Silrene, Nashianaster, the hospital I'd held a maintenance contract with for 6 years, Rauter, called to ask me to clarify something before he signed off on the renewal paperwork. He said there was a discrepancy between the entity name on the new contract and the license number on file. He was asking because the licensing board required the registered license holder to match the contracting entity, and the names weren't lining up. I did not know what he was talking about. I thanked Jim, told him I'd sort it out, and drove back to the house instead of to my next job site. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes with the truck running. Then I went inside and found the operating agreement I'd signed in 2018 and read it the way my father had always told me to read things before I signed them. It took me about an hour and a half, with my phone open, to look up terms I didn't know. What I found was this: the LLC had been structured with Diane as the managing member, with authority over administrative and financial decisions. I was a member with economic interest, but without managerial authority, and in the clause on membership transfers and asset assignments, the clause I hadn't stopped at, there, language authorizing the managing member to assign service contracts to affiliated entities without requiring consent of non-managing members. She had built a structure that let her move my contracts without my signature. I read that clause 3 times. The language was specific and the meaning was clear. It wasn't an oversight in the drafting, it was a design feature. I sat at the kitchen table with the operating agreement in front of me and tried to think about when this had started. Not the 2018 filing. That was the mechanism. The decision to build the mechanism. The moment when the plan had begun to take shape in someone's head. I couldn't find a date. I kept going back through years of ordinary days and not being able to identify the one where this had stopped being a marriage and started being a project. There's a particular kind of stillness that comes over a person when they understand a situation completely and simultaneously understand that there is nothing to be done right now, that the only useful response is patience and preparation. I sat in that stillness for about 20 minutes at the kitchen table. Then I put the operating agreement back in the folder and went to bed. I put the document down on the table. I looked at the kitchen for a while, not angry yet. That came later. What I felt first was the specific chill of a man who realizes the ground he's been standing on was never exactly where he thought it was. I called Aaron Pell the next morning. I'd thought about calling him the night before and decided against it. There's a version of that call that's just a man talking himself through something he already knows, and I didn't need to do that. I needed to sleep on it and see if it still looked the same in the morning. It did. Aaron is 62 years old and spent 26 years as an electrical engineer at the Tennessee Valley Authority before he retired. He lives 4 houses down from me, walks his dog past my place every morning around 6:30, and has approximately 0 patience for anything that isn't direct and factual. He is also, as it happens, the only person outside of Diane who knew that I had signed that operating agreement without reading it, because he'd asked me about it at the time, and I'd told him Diane had handled it. He'd said, without any particular drama, "You ought to read it, Ray." I'd said I would. I hadn't. When I called him that morning and told him what I'd found, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does your license number say on the county contracts?" I told him. He said, "And is that number registered to you personally or to the LLC?" I said, "To me, personally. Master electrician license is issued to the individual." He said, "Then I need you to pull the actual contract language before we talk further, not the cover sheet, the technical specification section, the part that says who is responsible for code compliance and sign-off." I pulled it. What Aaron helped me understand over the next 2 days, and I want to be specific about this because the specifics are what mattered, was not anything I couldn't have found on my own if I'd known what to look for. Aaron didn't have information I didn't have. He had a framework for reading it. 26 years of engineering contracts at a federal utility agency gives you a particular fluency in the language of professional licensing requirements, and that fluency was the thing I was missing. We sat on his back porch for most of both afternoons. He had a legal pad, and I had the contracts. He asked questions the way a good engineer asks questions, not to find out things he didn't know, but to confirm that the structure he was identifying was actually there. He asked and I answered, and by the end of the second afternoon, I could see exactly what I was looking at. What Aaron helped me understand over the next 2 days, him on his back porch with a yellow legal pad and me across the patio table with the contracts in a folder, changed how I understood everything that had happened in the previous 4 years. Tennessee electrical contractor law is specific. Any commercial project that requires a licensed master electrician for code compliance sign-off must have that sign-off from a named individual whose license is current and in good standing with the state licensing board. The license cannot be assigned to an entity. It belongs to a person. My name was on every code compliance document for every project Callaway Electrical had done since 2009. My license number was referenced in the technical specification clauses of every significant contract we held. Diane could transfer the entity. She could move the name on the billing. She could reassign the management structure. She could not transfer my license because my license wasn't property of the LLC. It was mine. The state had issued it to me, to my examination record, to my years of documented work. No operating agreement in the world could reassign it. Without my license, her new LLC couldn't touch the hospital contracts, couldn't touch the county contracts, couldn't touch the distribution center, because every one of those contracts, in their technical compliance language, required the license holder to be the named responsible party. She had spent 4 years building a structure to hollow out my business. The structure was sound. The one thing she hadn't fully calculated was that the most valuable thing in the business wasn't in the business. It was in my wallet. Aaron looked at me from across the patio table when we'd finished going through everything. He said, "She built the shell. She couldn't get to what was inside it." I sat with that for a minute. Then I said, "What do I do?" He said, "First, you call an attorney who does business law, not a general practitioner, someone who's worked with contractor licensing specifically. Second, you notify the county and the hospitals that there's a discrepancy in the contracting entity and that the license of record remains yours pending resolution. Third, you request dissolution of the LLC with a full accounting audit. And fourth," he paused, "you don't change anything about your routine until this is done, because she's going to notice when things start moving." I said, "How long?" He said, 4 to 6 weeks if you're organized." I said, "I'll be organized." He nodded once. That was the whole conversation. The Farragut cookout was 3 weeks later. It was her brother, Keith's 45th birthday. Keith is a commercial real estate broker, lives in a subdivision in Farragut, about 20 minutes west of the city, has a big backyard, and the kind of gas grill that costs more than my first van. The family was all there. Diane's mother, Keith, and his wife, Diane's sister Julie, and her husband, the nephews, a few of Keith's colleagues I'd met once or twice, maybe 25 people total. I drove out with Diane, got there around noon. I'd spent the previous week doing what Carol had told me to do, nothing visible. Every job site I went to, every client call I took, every invoice I sent out went through normal channels. I drove the same routes. I ate lunch at the same places. I did not change anything about the surface of my life, because changing anything would have been the same as announcing that I knew. But I had read every page of every contract I held, every technical specification clause, every licensing reference. I knew exactly what I had, so when I pulled into Keith's neighborhood in Farragut that Saturday, I was carrying something I hadn't been carrying the last time I'd been to one of these family events. Not anger, something quieter than that. The specific steadiness of a man who has done the preparation and now just has to let the situation develop. I drove out with Diane, got there around noon. The sun was already working hard for a Saturday in late May, and the smell of charcoal. Keith had started with charcoal before switching to gas, which was a conversation I'd had with him before, mixed with cut grass and whatever his wife had put out on the side tables. I'd been going to this family's gatherings for 10 years. I was comfortable in them the way you get comfortable with something you've accepted will never quite fit. You know where to stand. You know whose conversations to join and whose to let pass. You know how to spend an afternoon in a place where you are present but not quite central. Diane's family were not unkind people. They were people who had a particular vocabulary for success: real estate, corporate titles, weekend houses in the mountains. None of her spoke in that vocabulary. I was the electrician she'd married, not said with contempt, just said. That was the category. I'd been fine with that for 10 years, mostly. Around 2 in the afternoon, after the first round of food had gone around and people had settled into the lawn chairs, Keith's colleague, a man named Brendan, who did something in commercial leasing, made an offhand comment in a conversation I was only half listening to. He said he'd looked at the restructuring Diane had put together and that the trades guy wouldn't understand what he was signing over until the papers were already through. The trades guy. I didn't change my expression. Didn't move from where I was standing. Diane was sitting 12 feet away and she caught something in my face in that moment. I saw her see it. She stood up, came over, and said quietly, "That's out of context. I'll explain later." I said, "What restructuring did Brendan look at?" She said, "This isn't the time." I said, "You just made it the time." What followed lasted maybe 15 minutes, kept low because neither of us was built for public scenes. She said she was reorganizing the business structure for my benefit, that I would understand it better when she could walk me through it calmly, that what Brendan had said didn't mean what I thought it meant. Her mother drifted over. Keith came and stood nearby with his arms crossed in the posture of a man managing a situation. Diane's sister Julie said I always had trouble with the business side of things and that I should trust Diane on this. Nobody at that table thought I had a legitimate grievance. Diane looked at me with the expression she uses when a conversation is over. She said, "Two choices, Ray. You apologize for the scene, or you go home. I shook Keith's hand. Happy birthday. Walked to my truck. I took Chapman Highway back toward the city instead of the interstate, which takes longer but runs along the river, and I didn't turn the radio on. I was not angry on that drive. What I felt was something more like confirmation. The cookout had given me, more clearly than any document, a picture of the whole structure. The whole family had known, or had known, enough. The conversation with Brendan wasn't a slip. It was the kind of thing that gets said when nobody in the room thinks the person it concerns is a real variable in the outcome. I got back to the house at around 4 in the afternoon. The neighborhood was quiet in that particular Saturday way, where everyone's either inside or in their backyards. I parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a few minutes before going in. Made a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table for a while with the folder of documents I'd been keeping in the cabinet under the stairs. Then I called the attorney I'd found the previous week, a business lawyer in downtown Knoxville named Carol Whitman, who had 20 years of experience with contractor licensing disputes and had been referred to me by Jim Ostrander at the hospital. Carol was direct in the way that good attorneys are direct. No reassurance, just information. She confirmed what Aaron and I had identified about the license. She told me the steps. She told me the timeline. She said, the most important thing you can do right now is nothing visible. Continue your normal operations. Don't tip anything. When we're ready to move, we move all at once. I said, how will she know something's changed? Carol said, she'll start noticing that clients aren't responding the way she expects. That's when she'll start looking. I said, how long before that happens? She said, 3 weeks, maybe 4. Can you hold that? I said, I can hold it. Diane came back from Farragut the next day. I was already home when she got in. I'd come back earlier than she expected, and she walked into the kitchen to find me at the table with coffee and a crossword I'd started and stopped. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me at the cookout, searching for something I wasn't going to give her. She said, you left without saying goodbye to anyone. I said goodbye to Keith. She said, that's not what I mean. She made herself coffee, sat down across from me. She said, the conversation about the business needs to happen. Not today, but soon. I said, sure. She went to her office. I went to mine. She didn't know I'd spent the previous week meeting with Carol Whitman. She didn't know that Carol had already drafted the notification letters for the county and the hospitals, informing them that there was a discrepancy in the contracting entity and that the license of record remained mine pending legal resolution. She didn't know that Aaron had identified, through his own careful reading of the LLC documents, that the financial reporting of the second LLC Diane had established was already showing management fees to herself that had no corresponding service documentation. She thought she was still ahead of it. I let her think that. Those 3 weeks had a particular texture that I don't think I'll ever fully forget. The mornings were the same, 5 o'clock, coffee, 20 minutes at the table, but the 20 minutes felt different than they used to. Before, that time was just clearing my head before the day started. During those weeks, it was more like calibration, running through where each piece of the situation stood, what was in motion, what I needed to hold still. I went to work. I ran the jobs. One afternoon, I spent 4 hours in a utility corridor in a hospital building on the east side of the city, pulling wire through conduit in a space so tight I had to work on my side. And when I was done, I drove home and made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, while Diane worked in her office down the hall. She had no idea where I'd been or what I'd been thinking about while I was in that corridor. I had no reason to tell her. One evening, she came out to the living room while I was watching the end of a Vols game and sat down in the chair across from me. She didn't say anything for a few minutes. Then she said, "You seem different." I said, "Long week." She said, "The Farragut thing is still between us." I said, "I know." She waited for more. I turned the volume down slightly on the game, which was the only thing I did that acknowledged the conversation, and then I turned it back up when it was clear I wasn't going to say anything else. She went back to her office. I finished the game. She didn't ask again after that. The first move was the letters to the clients. Carol sent them on a Tuesday, carefully worded, no accusations, just a technical notice about licensing continuity. Jim Ostrander at the hospital called me directly that afternoon. He said he'd received the letter, that it clarified the situation for him, and that his team would pause the renewal process for the secondary entity until the matter was resolved. The county facilities office sent a written acknowledgement 2 days later, saying substantially the same thing. The second move was the formal dissolution request for the original LLC. As a member with economic interest, I had the right to demand a full accounting before any dissolution was finalized. Carol filed the request on a Thursday. The accounting would open the books. The third move came from Jim Ostrander's end, not mine. When his legal team reviewed the situation, they identified that the assignment of the contract to the second entity had been done without the required notification to their compliance department, and that this constituted a potential breach. They referred it to their outside counsel. I didn't ask for that. It followed from the disclosure. In the second week, Diane started picking up on something. She was careful. She didn't ask direct questions, but she was in the house differently, checking her phone when she thought I wasn't watching, coming into the room where I was working with reasons that weren't quite reasons. One evening, she asked how the Oak Ridge job was going. I told her. She nodded and didn't follow up, which was not how she listened when she was actually listening. I kept my routine. 5 a.m., coffee, 20 minutes at the table, work. In the third week, she got a call from her attorney. I knew it because she took it in the backyard, which she didn't normally do, and when she came back inside, she stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me in a way that was different from the week before. The week before, she'd been searching. Now she'd found something and was deciding what to do with it. She said, "The hospital put the renewal on hold." I said, "I know." She said, "You sent letters." I said, "Yes." She said, "When did you start this?" I said, "The morning after the cookout." She absorbed that. Then, "Why didn't you come talk to me first?" I looked at her the way I look at a wiring diagram when something doesn't match what I was told to expect. I said, "At Keith's, you gave me 2 choices. I picked a third." She said, "That has nothing to do with the business." I said, "It has everything to do with the business." I went to the cabinet under the stairs, took out the folder, put it on the kitchen table. I said, "Carol Whitman can walk you through any of it if you want a formal conversation, or you can read it yourself. The licensing clauses on the county contracts are flagged with yellow tabs." She sat down and read. It took her about 25 minutes. I stood in the kitchen doorway for part of it, watching without making it obvious I was watching. She read the way she always read documents, methodically, not skimming, occasionally going back to a line she'd already passed. She turned to the licensing clause page and stayed there longer than anywhere else. I watched her finger trace a line of text that I knew by memory at that point. There was a moment, I think it was about 15 minutes in, when she stopped turning pages and just sat with the folder open in front of her. She wasn't reading, she was thinking. I've known her long enough to tell the difference. When she finally looked up, the expression on her face was one I had not seen in 10 years of marriage. Not anger, not distress, something more controlled and more unsettled than either. The expression of someone who had built a thorough plan and has just found the one point where the load-bearing wasn't what they'd assumed. She said, "You wire buildings, Ray. I structure businesses. Those are not the same skill set." The line she'd prepared, maybe prepared with Brendan, maybe with her own attorney. The central premise of the whole arrangement, that I would not understand the mechanism until the mechanism was complete, because I didn't have the language for it. I let her say it, let it settle into the room. When she looked up, she had the expression of someone who has found the variable they failed to account for and is running the numbers again from the beginning. She said, "You wire buildings, Ray. I structure businesses. Those are not the same skill set." The line she'd prepared, the central argument of the whole plan, that I wouldn't understand what had been built around me until it was already done because I didn't have the vocabulary for it. I let her finish. Then I said, "The license compliance clauses in commercial electrical contracts are part of my skill set. They've been my skill set for 20 years. That's what you didn't calculate." She didn't respond. I stood in the kitchen and looked at her for a moment. She was still at the table, with the folder open. There was nothing left to say that the folder hadn't already said more precisely than I could say it. That's the thing about spending 20 years learning to document your work correctly. When you need the documentation to speak for you, it does. I went to the bedroom, picked up the bag I'd packed the night before, took the folder of documents, my keys. I stopped in the kitchen, put the envelope on the counter beside the coffee maker, where she always left her keys when she got home. I walked out. The envelope had 3 things in it. The first was the formal notice of LLC dissolution with accounting audit, signed by Carol Whitman as my legal representative, with the documentation of the licensing discrepancy and the client notifications attached. The second was a copy of the state licensing board's confirmation that my master electrician license was current, in good standing, and registered to me individually, not to any entity. The third was a note I wrote by hand. I built this business with 20 years of work. I documented job by job. I never needed you to understand how a conduit gets run through a concrete wall. I did need you to understand that it was mine. I drove to Aaron's place. He'd known I might be coming. I'd told him it was possible, and he'd left the porch light on. I could see his silhouette in the porch chair from the street. I parked and came around the side of the house. He handed me a beer without getting up. We sat on his back porch for a couple of hours without talking much about any of it. He had a cooler with a few beers. We watched the yard get dark. Somewhere down the street, a neighbor was running a mower in the last of the daylight. Dogs barked and stopped barking. The temperature dropped a few degrees, and Aaron got up once to get a sweatshirt and brought one for me too without asking. At some point he said, "You holding up?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Good." That was about all that needed to be said. The accounting audit, once the books were opened, found what Aaron had suspected: management fees recorded in the second LLC that had no corresponding service agreements, drawn over a period of roughly 3 years. The total was significant enough that it ended up part of the dissolution settlement. I didn't pursue anything beyond what the legal process required. I didn't need to. The hospital renewed its maintenance contract directly with me, with Callaway Electrical, operating under my license, same as it had been for 6 years before any of this started. The county did the same. The distribution center off I-75 never left. They'd been calling my cell phone the whole time anyway. Diane's attorney sent one letter through Carol after the dust settled. It was short. I didn't respond to it personally. Carol handled it. I still don't know exactly what Brendan knew or what he'd been asked to look at. It doesn't matter much now. Keith sent me a text about 6 weeks after everything concluded. It said he'd only known part of it, that he'd assumed I was going to be kept in the loop, and that he was sorry for how it went. I read it twice, typed back, "Appreciate you saying that." Didn't reply further. Her mother didn't reach out. Her sister Julie didn't either. The dissolution was finalized 68 days after Carol filed the initial paperwork. The accounting found what Aaron had suspected it would find. The settlement reflected that. I didn't celebrate any of it. I went to work on a Tuesday when the paperwork cleared and came home that evening and made chicken and rice in the kitchen of the same house I'd been living in, and it felt more or less like every other Tuesday. The difference was a specific absence of weight I hadn't noticed I'd been carrying. I moved out of the house in September, took the things that were mine, left what wasn't, and didn't make it complicated because it didn't need to be complicated. I'm in a 2-bedroom apartment in North Knoxville now, about 1.5 miles from the old house. It's smaller. The kitchen window looks out at a parking lot, but there's a dogwood tree at the edge of the lot that bloomed white in April and now is just leaves, which is fine. Things don't need to be in bloom to be worth looking at. I'm up at 5, coffee, 20 minutes at the table. Callaway Electrical has 9 contracts now, 3 more than before any of this started, because 2 new clients came in during the resolution period when word got around in the facilities management community that my license had stayed clean through a complicated situation, and 1 referral came directly from Jim Ostrander. I hired a 4th full-time employee in March. He's 24, from Maryville, drove up for the interview in a truck that was 12 years old and showed up in work clothes instead of interview clothes because, he said, he didn't want me to think he was something he wasn't on the job. I hired him that afternoon. He asks more questions than anyone I've ever worked with. Not because he doesn't know things, but because he wants to understand why the answer is what it is before he accepts it. I gave him a raise after 60 days. My father would have liked him. Aaron came by in October on a Sunday afternoon when the trees along the interstate were starting to turn and the air had that particular Tennessee fall quality that makes you want to be outside as long as possible before winter closes in. We drove out to a barbecue place on Clinton Highway that he'd been saying we should try for 2 years. We split a rack of ribs and ate at a picnic table outside while the interstate hummed in the distance. After a while, he said, without looking at me, "Did you know in 2018 that it was a risk?" I said, "I knew there was something I didn't understand. I chose to trust it instead of learn it." He said, "Trusting isn't the same as not looking." I said, "No. But there's a difference between not knowing something and deciding that not knowing is your permanent condition." I didn't know business structure. That was real. The mistake was thinking that gap couldn't be closed. He was quiet for a minute. I said, "You know what the thing is. She knew more about the structure than I did. That's true. But she didn't know the contracts better than I did because I wrote them. I was there for every negotiation. I know what Jim Ostrander asked for in year 2 when he wanted the response time clause modified. I know which county inspector signs off on which type of installation and what he actually needs to see in the documentation. I know those contracts the way I know a wiring diagram, completely, because my name is on the sign-off, and there's no room for approximation." Aaron said, "That's what she didn't calculate." I said, "She calculated everything except that, and that was the only thing that mattered." There's something this whole experience taught me that isn't about LLC structures or licensing clauses or how to read an operating agreement before you sign it. Those are real lessons and worth learning. But the thing underneath them is this. I spent 10 years being the trades guy in a family where the vocabulary of success ran through corporate titles and business degrees and deals done at the right tables in the right rooms. I didn't fight that categorization. I didn't resent it much. I just existed in it. Because my work was my work and it didn't need their vocabulary to be real. But somewhere along the way, I started acting from inside that category instead of from outside it. I started signing documents without reading them. Because that's not my area. I started letting decisions about my business get made by someone else because she knows more about structure than I do. I started treating the gap in my knowledge as a permanent condition instead of a gap I could close whenever I decided to close it. And that was the only mistake that was mine. Because the master electrician license that saved every significant contract I had, the license that was the one thing the whole scheme couldn't touch, was not a technicality. It was 20 years of examination, documentation, and work done right in front of inspectors who don't pass work that isn't right. Nobody gave that to me. Nobody can take it from me, and nobody can reassign it because it isn't a business asset. It's a record of what I know and what I've done. Here's the thing I've thought about a lot since then. The plan was good. It was patient. It was layered. It was built on a real and accurate understanding of a gap in my knowledge. Diane knew that I didn't read business documents carefully. She knew I trusted her on the structure side. She knew that the trades guy in that family was never going to be the one who caught the operating agreement language that mattered. All of that was true. She read me correctly on every one of those points. The one thing she didn't account for was that the most valuable thing in my business wasn't in the business. It was in my wallet on a card from the Tennessee State Board of Examiners for Contractors, a card that I'd had to earn, that I'd had to renew, that I'd had to document my continuing education for every 2 years. A card that existed because I had passed an examination that a lot of people fail, and because I had spent years before that examination doing work that prepared me to pass it. That card doesn't belong to an LLC. It doesn't belong to an operating agreement or a restructuring plan or a managing member with 60%. It belongs to the person who earned it. What you build with your hands, nobody understands better than you. That doesn't change based on what vocabulary the other person is using or what titles are on the business cards in the room. Have you ever let someone convince you that you didn't understand your own thing, that your way of working was less valid because it didn't have the right name in the right language? And what did you do with that? There is a version of this story where I never called Aaron the morning after I found what was in that operating agreement, where I could Diane directly, said what I knew, and let the situation go sideways in the emotional way that would have served her plan better than mine. There's a version where the cookout in Farragut ends with me saying something I can't take back, and the family gets to describe that moment for years afterward as the evidence they needed. I didn't give them that moment. Not because I was disciplined in some heroic way, because the work of the previous weeks had made the next step clear, and clear next steps don't need drama. Because there are two ways to respond when someone tells you you're the trades guy and they're the ones who handle the real business. The first way is to believe them. The second way is to go find the document that has your name on it, read it all the way through, and understand exactly what it says before you sign anything else. If this story landed somewhere for you, if you recognized something in it from your own work, your own marriage, your own situation where someone reorganized what you built and told you it was for your benefit, hit like, leave a comment, tell me what you would have done differently or what you did when something like this happened to you. These stories exist because this happens more often than people talk about, and talking about it is the first step toward not letting it happen in silence. Subscribe to the channel. Every week there's a new story, and they're all about the same thing: what a man does when everything gets taken and what he finds out he still has. Until next time.